I hate when I do that.
Abbie, I think we want to give another couple of minutes for people to jump on. I'm sure people are grabbing their lunch. Let's wait 2 more minutes and then go ahead and get started, if that's okay, Abbie.
Sounds like a plan.
Thanks.
Try to not say anything that upsets your lunch this afternoon.
No promises from me.
How are you, Abbie?
Doing well, keeping busy.
Great.
Short week for me this week. I'm going to Italy on Wednesday, so I'm like,
Oh, exciting.
Cool.
You're in
Yeah.
Italy.
We're flying into Rome, and then we have a couple of day trips planned. We're gonna go to Florence and Pompeii, of course. So yeah, I'm excited.
Yay,
Very
you.
exciting.
I love history, so I would love to do anything like that.
Totally.
The Pompeii tour is worth having a guide at.
We
So
got
that
we did get a guide.
Good.
Yeah, that's good.
Good.
Good advice.
Yeah.
I think it's a bit overwhelming to do like
Yeah.
a self-guided thing, but
Yeah. Give it 1 more minute, everyone, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
I see that I have a couple of students in here, so I'm excited about that.
all right, shall we jump into it? I've got some notes to get started with before we get to the meat of the conversation. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for AAF Nebraska's AdReads. I'm Abbie Perry. I'm a marketing strategist at Ervin Smith, and I also serve on the AAF Nebraska Professional Development Committee, which helped put on this event. As most of you probably know, AAF Nebraska is an organization to unify advertising professionals across the state. Our goal is to educate, inspire, and build a strong, inclusive community so we can keep doing the work we love and encourage generations to join and continue it on. Events like today's webinar are free for members as part of your membership benefits. Throughout the year, our board and committees work hard to add value through monthly professional development programs, opportunities to connect with experts and fellow creatives, as well as advocacy in our industry. So we'll work on offering both virtual and in-person events, from panel discussions to thought leadership and just for fun activities. So if you haven't already, grab your lunch. Feel free to make sure your audio is muted during this channel, but the chat is wide open. I'll keep an eye on that. And so if you have any questions as we go through today, drop it in the chat and I'll make sure that we bring that question up. Thank you to our sponsors. We've got Basis Technology, Woodman Life, and Envoy Inc. And then a couple of quick updates on upcoming events. This Thursday, April 1st, there's networking and arcade competition night at Arcade 33, open to all skill levels of gamers. May 5th from 4 to 7 p.m. at Pite 9 Brewing Company, we have an arts and crafts night where you will be able to design your own souvenir glass, bid on work from local artists, and enjoy craft beer and appetizers. And then on May 13th at Hopcat in Lincoln, we've got a case study presentation event called Challenge Accepted. We're going to have case studies from Eleanor Creative, UNL, Pixel Bakery, and then also Ervin and Smith. My team will be taking everyone through a case study. And then tickets for that are also available on our site. And so with all of that, we are really excited today to welcome Jeremy Harris Lipschultz, world-renowned author and digital media expert. He'll be discussing his newest book, Social Media Measurement and Management, Entrepreneurial Digital Analytics, second edition. Lipschultz is a Peter Kiewit Distinguished Professor at UNO, and this title is one of several Routledge publications, including upcoming editions on social media law, ethics, and communication. So with that, Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us for this event today.
Glad to be here.
We'll just jump right into it with some of these questions. We wanted to start out with some industry concerns and future regulations. So to kick it off, with the threats to the advertising and communication world in general being the sharing of proprietary information, along with misinformation and plagiarism as identified in your book, what kind of legal regulations do you foresee in the near future?
I think it's difficult to entirely predict the answer to that question, but I'll give you my best shot at it. It was interesting. As you mentioned, I have an upcoming book that I've been working on, social media law and ethics, and there is some overlap with this book. But I went back last night and reread this book because it's been almost a year and a half since I wrote it, and it seems like forever because there is so much change on a daily basis. And I think from a technology perspective, that disruption continues to be the word we have to keep in mind. I've been chasing this. I'm a former journalist before I got back into higher education, and I've been chasing it as a journalist would as a tech story for about 20 years now. And I've met a lot of people in the industry. I've learned a lot about, kind of how they think. It was interesting because I was listening to a podcast the other day with tech reporters from publications like Wired that do this every day. And, they were comparing their perspective with, for example, political reporters that in some cases are very stunned right now with what's happening with Elon Musk and Donald Trump's administration. And they're not so much stunned as kind of plugging it into that larger technological, political, social context of change. And so I think as industry people, you probably already have that perspective that things are always changing, they're fluid. When I start my law class every spring, I tell the students, the editor of our book, Watt Hopkins at Virginia Tech, says the law is ever changing. And it has to be ever changing because we are changing faster and faster, right? So that is, if you were to do a SWOT analysis, that's both threats and opportunities. There are winners and losers in every game of change. And you have to kind of anticipate where your space is going. And here in our meeting today, there may be many different spaces, different contexts for looking at this topic. So, you have to kind of stay on top of what is relevant for you and who is relevant for you. So, as I talk about this today, I'll make reference, and the book makes reference to people who have resonated with my journey through this space. I started at UNO 36 years ago. And obviously for you, Abbie, but even for a lot of people who are older, it's hard to put ourselves back in the world that was in 1989, as I like to tell my students, way back in the last century. You want to know history? Come talk to me. I lived half of that century. But, when I arrived on campus, for example, there were, and I can tell you exactly about the number, there were under 50 people on campus with a computer, because we were using a tool to send messages pre-internet. The internet followed kind of for us as a connection the next year. And you could pull up a list of everybody on campus who was online. And most of us who were online were there because we were working on research projects and we were communicating with people either across the country and across the world. So I think for some of us who were doing that early on, it was easier to see what was about to happen. And I was hired as the radio broadcasting professor because that's what my background was. I was a news director, reporter, and engineer in Illinois and Indiana, and went to Southern Illinois University. And that's what UNO was looking for, so we were a perfect match. But literally the minute I arrived on campus, this wave started to come. I was one of the first faculty members to go into the department chair, now the late Hugh Cowden, who just passed away recently. And Hugh had the old typewriter on his side desk. And I said, Professor Cowden, I need a computer. And he looked at me as he often did and paused and thought about it and said, well, let me think about that. He wanted to know why. And I said, because this is where my work is going. And, the early part of that work was just digital audio, getting us from tapes, reel-to-reels, cassettes to digital audio that could be edited, which we all take for granted now. But yeah, the internet came quickly. Computer-mediated communication came quickly because people were in chat rooms. They were already doing almost Reddit-like communication in the 1980s when I was in Indiana. It was clunky, but you could do it back then. And what changed was this kind of diffusion to the mass public and to the point where everybody takes all of this technology for granted. I mean, I filed my taxes Sunday in about 2 hours on TurboTax, which is incredibly easier and faster than it used to be when I would sit at the dining room table with a stack of papers. So, we like to push the easy button. That's one of the advantages. One of the disadvantages is we don't read terms of service and user agreements when we click the checkbox. We don't always acknowledge the ability of the technologist to invade our privacy. I don't think we press our elected representatives enough to protect our privacy. Some states have done and are doing it better than others. Nebraska is behind the curve on this. States like California, Illinois, Florida have developed fairly strong data privacy regulation. The federal government, because of the political gridlock, because of the polarization, don't expect a whole lot from Congress. But as we've seen in the last couple of months, expect a lot from the executive branch because Donald Trump has empowered, like the FCC commissioner and others, to go forth and do as much as the courts will let them do. So I think, embedded in all of that are opportunities and threats, but we just have to find the opportunities and as much as we can, minimize the threats.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of good points you covered there. 1989, I remember that really well. Just kidding. No, I like what you said. I think as advertisers and marketers, so much is changing, and from a legal perspective, with our administration, even empowering, not only the FCC, but also it makes me think of like the Zucks of the world, right? With Meta and the changes that we've seen them recently making. It's important for us to stay on top of those things and the work that we're all doing.
Yeah, Zuck is kind of following Elon Musk and the move toward crowdsourcing
Mhm.
problematic content, which we're not sure how well that works. I haven't seen a good study on that yet, but and I have mixed emotions about this because as someone who has been a strong proponent of First Amendment freedom of expression, I'm all about openness, transparency as much as we can do it. But we certainly have to respect the fact that, people have NDAs, client relationships involve a degree of private communication. And we have to sort of balance the desire to promote our personal brand, to put ourselves out there, to strengthen who we are online and offline, but also to be obviously very strategic about it and not to just kind of bumble our way through, the famous examples of drunk tweeting are not a good idea. That usually doesn't end well. And so we've got to be, I think, cautious. And that's probably one of the biggest changes I've seen, particularly since the early days of Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, is it was kind of a Wild West as the internet was in the 90s, a Wild West. And then over time, we create some guardrails, we create some boundaries, your employer creates social media policies, and we all begin to develop some kind of social understandings about what's appropriate or not.
Speaking of those guidelines, what kind of policies do you think advertising and other comms organizations need to have in place to manage the use of AI?
Yeah, I thought that was a good question. The first, my first thought about it is just, I guess, reflecting for a moment on, the silos that existed even a decade ago between advertising, public relations, marketing. I'd even throw journalism and broadcasting into the mix. The fact that, we really saw those at one time as a fairly distinct set of fields that you could go into. And I mean, at the university level, we, going back to when I began all of this, we had a broadcasting degree program, we had a journalism degree program, and public relations and advertising were in the journalism program. And, while I was director of the school, that would have been somewhere in that 2009, 10, 11 period, we collapsed everything into journalism and media communication, JMC, so that no matter what you were studying, you would get a taste of everything. You get a taste of podcasting, television, audio, so that you would have at least a general understanding of the tools that we have available. So with that said, I would say for advertising and maybe kind of throwing in marketing and PR specifically, because I kind of see a lot of those trends in that direction, I would say the biggest regulatory advance at this point is coming from states regulating to protect children. And there's always been an exception in First Amendment law that minors, people underage, that we can do things to in the broadcast regulations to assist parents who want to protect their children from, say, indecency on the broadcast airwaves. So that was kind of the precedent that we bring to all of this. And we don't have, the Supreme Court is just now hearing some cases that kind of raise questions about just how far these state regulations can go in places like Florida and Texas. And Utah has been a leader in this as well. And their newest move is to say, that you have to be an adult to download an app. And of course, some of the concern, I think, is grounded in the fact that, for younger children and even young adults, there are real things that we should be worried about, right? We should be concerned about addiction. Internet, social media addiction is real. I mean, there's some good data on that. We have good evidence that, things like body image can be distorted by social media influencers who are selling products and not following Federal Trade Commission guidelines to transparently disclose what they're doing. And the FTC over the years has tried to fine offenders. It's sort of light regulation, but it's some regulation. And at a global level, the European Union, the right to be forgotten in Google searches, privacy regulations, which really follow more of a foundation in that privacy is a human right. I'm just getting to privacy in my law class this week, so it's front of mind. But there's a whole interesting history because in our legal system, under British common law, even the king couldn't enter your home without an invitation. And so the idea was that your home was your castle. It was your sanctuary. It was where you could go to have privacy. And the idea that psychologically privacy is something we need from time to time. But what happened in the mobile first age that we live in, I mean, get in any elevator, walk down any street, people are on the phone. And if you are carrying a phone, you're being tracked in one way or another. I always encourage people to go in and look at their privacy settings and review them and understand them. I'm an iPhone user, and I know not everybody is, but in the Apple arena, you get some reminders about that when you have a door open. It's really important to go back and look fairly regularly, maybe every 3 months, and see, because I find that privacy settings somehow or another get open that I thought were closed. And even with privacy settings, we give up a degree of privacy. If you post on Facebook, you can't stop people from screenshotting. Same with Snapchat. I mean, even though it was sold that way as the disappearing content. And we have cases on that too. So, I mean, it is kind of a buyer beware era that we live in. And I think with the new Trump administration and the technology people sort of getting behind it and hoping that they get a reward from that, I think it's even more important for us to recognize that their fiduciary responsibility in a public company like Meta is to their shareholders. And, just as, the kind of the critical perspective on advertising is that, they're selling our eyeballs essentially, on a cost per thousand basis. So that's the academic kind of view of this. I think the industry view is we ought to set our own guardrails, and they should be more ethical than whatever the law allows, because the law allows more than probably what is ethical. And that's why this book I'm working on right now that's in production is Social Media Law and Ethics. I sort of changed course within the last 25 years ago. I used to be really a law guy, all about the Supreme Court precedent, all about, the jargon in the law and the Latin and the whole thing. And I came to realize when I studied broadcast indecency and other research topics such as social media, that an awful lot is really more determined by how people behave and their willingness to exercise some social responsibility in all of this. So yeah, we all have to make money. We all have to make a living. We all have to be profitable if we have an agency or whatever it might be. But I think we'll all sleep better at night if, we don't let greed overtake us. And I know that's easy to say and it's harder to do, but I think we just need to keep that in mind in our day-to-day operations, that there are times that the best course of actions is to say, no, we're going to do this and not that, because we're going to make money, we're going to make enough money, and it's going to be a better outcome for everybody involved.
Yeah, doing good is good business, right? I like the ethical consideration of that. I'm curious from your perspective, and what you tell your students, but what role does AI play in all of this? And what are you telling folks how do we regulate it? How do we wrap our hands around it and start to use it for good, but also make sure we're using it in an ethical way and eventually, I think a legal way, right?
Well, we would hope that there are going to be at least some guardrails on AI that don't exist right now. It certainly is the elephant in the room. It's what we need to be concerned with. And it's, again, if you pull back from advertising and look at it much more broadly, it is already impacting every aspect of our lives. So I think the first thing we need to understand is this is a huge shift as we move forward with it. I had a friend we brought to Omaha when we were doing the curriculum revision, David Matheson, who had a website called Be the Media. He now works with chief digital officers and people in large corporations trying to manage change. But, David, took the view early on in the social media wave that we went through that, what if we were back in the Renaissance period? Would we have recognized the transformation that was happening if we were in the middle of it? And I think we're running kind of a similar game right now with AI. It's happening before our eyes, but we don't really grasp how fundamental the change is in our lives. I mean, AI is going to transform healthcare. It's, to some degree already transforming all businesses that use chatbots, for example. The chatbots are being trained by every caller and they get smarter over time, right? They get that feedback and learn language. And I'm lucky because I've been informed in part by my son-in-law, who came out of the University of Michigan and worked early on in this type of language and technology intersection with a company called Narrative Science that was later bought up by Salesforce. And I would have these great conversations with him about, in a general sense, about how worried should I be about AI as I, write and research social media. And, he always gave me, I think, what is still good advice today, which is it's not as smart as some people think it is. It's still a work in progress. It still makes mistakes. And so you don't want to turn the whole thing over to AI, right? So if you're creating a campaign or content, could AI create something for you? Maybe. But would you want it to? Probably not, right? So we have to, again, just as we've done with every other tool, treat it as a tool that can help us in some cases and can harm us. So again, strengths and weaknesses. Think about early technology like spell check in Word, right? Spell check could give you the wrong word early on, could give you the wrong there, if you weren't careful. So you had to know language and grammar to really take the benefits from, Word as it started to build this technology in through Microsoft. And I think the same thing is already happening with AI when, you see these suggestions for changes in something that you're writing. So, I think the bigger issues probably are going to revolve around audio and video and animation and intellectual property, because we've already had the Copyright Office a couple of years ago issue a clarification. And it's an interesting read. It's about a 6-page document. If you look it up, I could probably dig out a link somewhere. But basically what it said was, copyright law as we developed it in the United States is for human creativity, to basically encourage human creativity and for humans to benefit from that. And so artificial intelligence is not human per se, though humans may use AI, but when they do, if they're going to come to the Copyright Office, they have to disclose transparently, what did you do here and what did the AI do? And then they'll make a judgment. That's kind of where they've come down. Again, we're just starting to get to the point where the courts are going to become involved in these cases. But it's going to be a somewhat complex environment, just as it is with other aspects of what's happening inside the Beltway in DC. A lot of it is going to get bottled up in the courts for years to come. It happened with social media, and it's still going on, that it took years and years and years of cases before the Supreme Court, for example, ruled in the Snapchat cheerleader case and said, generally speaking, school administrators can regulate against disrupting classrooms within a campus, but then it's a fuzzier line off campus when things are going on people's mobile phones. So there's some gray area, and there's going to be a lot of gray area with AI in terms of, to what extent are the coders involved in this question of creative intellectual property. If they're the ones generating the code that creates an image, for example, or transforms an image. And again, copyright law speaks to that question of transformative. If you just If you just take somebody's work and use it, that's going to be a violation of intellectual property, depending upon how much you use and in what context. Well, if you make an argument that you're transforming a work, like you're sampling music and you're transforming it into something else, then maybe you have a creative argument to make. And I think the same thing is going to happen with AI, that people are going to have to explain and be fairly explicit on how the work transformed what already existed.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. I think I've started to notice that in some recent case studies I've been reading, and like how folks have used AI to generate insights for briefs and things like that to launch campaigns. So it's definitely becoming more and more obvious. And I think we're all figuring it out a bit together. The
In
fallacies in AI are so prevalent too. Like I recently tried to get ChatGPT to give me a perfect March Madness bracket, and it couldn't even pull in the right teams, no matter how many websites I gave it to crawl or anything like that. So it's definitely,
apparently just picking the first seed
yeah, right.
is the way to go this
I
year.
think
Anyway,
I
not
think
always, but
NIL has something to do with that a
yeah,
bit.
NIL and the portal. If you haven't studied that, take a look at that. I have a student assignment on NIL and the portal because, it teaches undergraduates, for example, why they need to be entrepreneurial, because the student athletes have certainly been allowed to do that under current NCAA rules.
No doubt. Okay, I want to move a bit more specifically into social media. One of the things you point out in your book is that social media managers must critically evaluate the use of all data and metrics as they innovate in all of their different practices. So, what kind of metrics are going to be the most critical when getting the data needed is becoming increasingly more expensive?
My answer is going to be unsatisfactory to you and everybody, because it's the same answer I give when people ask me about media effects. The answer is it depends. It really does depend upon what your plan is, what your goals are, and your strategies and tactics. I mean, you have to have some kind of I would use the word theoretic, some kind of conceptual framework of what change you're trying to affect here. And it really does depend. I mean, I think you were interested in kind of dismissing vanity metrics, and I'm generally with you on that. But it goes back to, what are you trying to achieve? And so you've got to look at the context for what's the type of human behavior that you're trying to change or reinforce. And what are the channels that work best for doing that? And are there targeted individuals like influencers and audience members that you want to reach? I mean, obviously, over the years in PR, the model was, you cultivated media relations with key journalists, and then you hope that they would write a nice story about you, and then you organically got some of that out there. Advertising, I think if we pull back the zoom on that, the idea was obviously everything from the smallest local ad campaign to the Super Bowl. The idea was to reach as many people as you could with the message that you were trying to brand, and get that brand out there, and hope that it was there when people had to make some kind of a decision. I think social marketing changes this to a degree. They certainly think it changes it to a degree, that it becomes about some different ways of doing business. I can tell you, you mentioned I have 4 books that I've promoted, right? 4 social media books plus the additional editions. And, I have to kind of look at customer journey when I look at how am I going to sell a few books. And it's not like it's not a bestseller. So I'm targeting certain types of people who would be interested in a social media book, whether for a classroom textbook or just a book they want to read, to stay up to date on these things. And, I found early on that developing an Amazon author page was a good thing. Probably a better thing even than my publisher's page. Although for academics, because they get review copies, that sometimes is the better page for them. And so, I was looking for ways to make people aware besides just making organic social media posts about, and trying to drive some traffic. And I, in this book and elsewhere, I make the argument that if you learn search engine optimization and the principles of the web as it existed before AI, because I'm not sure those principles for Google are going to be the same going forward with AI, but traditional principles of search engine optimization, that they apply in a lot of different contexts about, how we drive organic and paid traffic to sites where we want people to be. And, so I found out early on in Twitter, and it still exists on X, that in your bio, you can put a link. Same with LinkedIn. You can put a link there. And so I did that, and I started to treat profile views as a key performance indicator, because it was at least an indirect way for me to see that they were going to be exposed to that link, and that at least some of them were going to click on it and find my Amazon author page. And lo and behold, I can't, and this is where it gets a little fuzzy. I don't have enough precision in the data to kind of entirely track my customer journey, but I have enough indirect evidence, like, for example, that I still get people buying books that I wrote in like the late 1990s and early 2000s that are mainly available there. I get some evidence when I get my royalty statements, which haven't made me rich, but, it helped me, buy a classic car at one time. So, I think you have to look at your individual context. Likewise, LinkedIn. I mean, my first assignment with every undergraduate is to try to develop their personal brand on LinkedIn. And I find most of them have been on there and they've got like a business card format for it. And I think it's got to be much more developed than that to be useful. And you have to keep updating it, because I find, every time I go back in there a few times a year, I got to update that. That's changed, or this has changed. And so you want to be as current as you can, because people do find you this way. And maybe some of those people are people you want to know and do business with, and build relationships with. And then the other aspect of LinkedIn that I have really pivoted toward, especially with the chaos that Elon created on Twitter, moving to X and Blue Sky. I'm still in both places, but it's fairly chaotic and not as useful as it once was. I even find some of those people that I used to communicate with in those spaces, I'm back on Facebook communicating with, which is interesting. But, an individual makes a difference. If I make a post about something that I'm working on LinkedIn, and Chancellor Lee likes it, so she's seen it and she engages with that content, well, that's a very important person, right? That's the boss. So, she has the power to do some good in my space, in the School of Communication. So I have always found that as a value proposition, to spend time. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to be there all the time, but it means I'm going to be there regularly. I mean, I have a morning routine with my morning coffee and breakfast, and I generally jump across all of my main social media platforms to do what we call real-time social media listening. And I don't find that it takes more than 35, 40 minutes to do this, but I think it's time well spent. I remember when I did my first social media communication book back in I would have been working on that in about 2012, 2013. And I was up in Chicago visiting at Golan. At that time, they had the bridge, they called it, in the John Hancock building. And it was this wonderful real-time social media listening center where every morning, the staff basically had a board that they were writing what they were seeing on their feeds. And they were monitoring television, morning television. They were monitoring news wires. They were monitoring all of the social media channels. And they could get out of that an aggregate of here's the moment we're in now. This morning on March 31st, now this afternoon. And that's important information, probably more important information than any data that you'll ever glean, on these measurement platforms, because it gives you the context to know, how you can fit in with messaging. And I think that sometimes is discounted more than it should be, because I've over the years had people push back on why social media, why are you spending the time you spend on social media? And some people, again, think I'm spending more time than I do, but I spend my time strategically, either, first thing in the morning, lunchtime, late at night, or if I'm alerted to something is going on that I need to know to see what the conversation is. And I'm lucky because almost 42 years ago, in September, I married a fellow journalist, and she's my radar. Sandy is on there when I'm too busy doing something else. She's on there letting me know that there's something I better pay attention to. So I think offices can work this way as well. You need to have people listening, and a way within, whether you're using Signal, that's the app conversation in the last couple of weeks, whether you're using Signal or some other app in a group chat, you need to, maybe it's Teams. A lot of businesses use Microsoft Teams, but you need a way during your business day to keep alert to what has changed, not only in the last, we used to talk about 24-hour news cycle. It's like, what's happened in the last 15 minutes, right? It's not easy, but it's vital information from a social media communication perspective to know that what you're saying is on message, that you're representing your organization in a way that doesn't make anybody look silly. Because that's the number one threat is, right, that you look totally ridiculous, and you get canceled or something like that, right, on social media. Nobody wants that. You want to be able to use it as a progressive force, for good, as we talked about earlier, social good. So if you have that filter, but you also have to have it within the context of knowing the realities of the world at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know about you, but the Signal memes are getting out of hand on my feed. It's been pretty interesting to watch that all unfold. I think you answered my next question, which was going to be about a company or an organization that does a good job of using data to inform their social media strategy. I'm curious, how should social managers or folks managing a social media, not only for themselves, but maybe a client or the organization that they work for, balance, that qualitative data, so social listening, sentiment with quantitative data?
Let's see if I can share. I indeed can share. So I wanted to share one of the early thought leaders that I followed in the very early days of Twitter, Gary Vaynerchuk. And I follow him not so much because I agree about everything he does as a social marketer, but he's got this LinkedIn 360 site now, and he uses LinkedIn pretty effectively as a CEO. And I think every CEO, I sort of was trained in this idea by Richard Edelman of Edelman PR, that the CEO has necessarily to be kind of the front face of an organization. But the reason I like the way Gary approaches it is not, again, because I agree with everything he does, but because he forces me to think about all of my assumptions. Because he pushes the envelope about as far as you can push things like transparency and authenticity and putting yourself out there, even when you don't look your best. I mean, I remember this moment one late night on Twitter, and he was at LAX and his flight was delayed, and he was, he looked awful. He'd had about a 22-hour day flying from New York to LA and back. But he was on there with a live video stream talking to people who follow him. And, the value of that is that not only are you cultivating a network, a social network, as my colleague Mark Smith at the Social Media Foundation talks a lot about, but that you're also, communication is also listening. You and I are having a conversation, we're listening to each other. And that, learning from each other in a time of rapid, dramatic technological and social change is really important, to not kind of be in our filter bubble. The thing that has gotten us all in trouble here is, we're in these filter bubbles, and we're not listening to everybody and their points of view and why they think the way they do. I think more than ever, we got to have communication and conversations. And the thing that I've always been drawn to, and why I've been having such a focus with social media communication for years, is it gives us opportunities to interact with people we would otherwise never have a chance to have a conversation with. So when I look at Blue Sky, for example, I'm being introduced, just like the early days of Twitter, I'm being introduced to people I didn't know. And I'm following some points of view that I wasn't aware of. I mean, I'm an older faculty member. So one of the things that I have to keep doing is learning about the new players in the field as the old ones retire, and being aware of, what some of the current researchers are doing and what their perspective is in it. Their life experience is a lot different from mine. I've been lucky to have a couple of kids that I've learned a lot from. And they both have a lot of tech savvy, and they both have a lot of friends who have tech savvy. And so they've sucked me into some things. I mean, we're talking about Signal. Our daughter got us on a Signal group probably, I don't know, like 4 years ago or something. It's been a while. So, and I was just learning about encryption at that time. There's a journalism professor down in Texas, Daxton Chip Stewart, who actually was at the time was having an assignment for his law students to basically get on Signal and send a message, just because reporters were starting to use Signal as a way to talk to their sources in a way that couldn't be monitored. And, it's an interesting technology, this end-to-end encryption technology, because at least the way it's supposed to work is the only thing that it tracks is that you were on there at what day and time, and not any of the content of what you're saying. Somewhat like the way our cell phone systems are supposed to work, that, they just know that you had a communication at a certain time and that you used a cell tower, but not that, what you said in that text message, for example. Now, we've had some challenges with this in all political contexts, with, like, for example, the FBI wanting a backdoor, law enforcement wanting a backdoor into these sites to access deeper levels of data, or, to what extent is the cloud saving content that we've deleted. We've seen that, like with Instagram terms of services, where if you delete an account, they still have the data for a period of time. And so, you can never sort of assume, when you turn your phone on, your laptop, whatever it is, you never really assume that somebody isn't listening. We used to talk about in radio, when I taught radio, the microphone is always open. And it's a good rule of thumb, whether or not you have an Alexa, the microphone is always open. Your phone is a microphone, and you're carrying it around with you. I remember in the early days, there was a great PBS program. This is now probably 25 years ago. And the marketers were talking about how could they track people better. And they were talking about, out on the farm, when we would put tracking devices on the cattle, and that's gotten much more sophisticated now if you know anything about Nebraska agriculture. But they thought, wow, what if you could do that with people? And that was a what if 25 years ago. Now, you couldn't have created a better tracking device than mobile phones that are ubiquitous. We have them, we use them all the time, and they are trackable. Now, some of that is good in an emergency situation. You might want people to know where you are. But some of it is not so good because, again, going back to the original idea of invasion of privacy, um, your home is no longer really your sanctuary because of the Internet of Things, the Internet of Devices. I just added a Vine thermostat. So presumably somewhere somebody might know what my indoor temperature is, what my relative humidity is. If that data point is of value to somebody, it might be. But we've all had the experience of having conversations and then finding ourselves on Meta, Facebook, or Instagram and seeing a very suspiciously relevant ad. Where's that coming from? Is somebody listening? And there's not a huge clarity in my mind. Maybe somebody here has better evidence than I've been able to find in a transparent way of just how much that's a factor in targeting advertising today. I'd love to know your perspectives on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, targeting is just getting more and more sophisticated, but at the same time, regulations are getting tighter on certain industries. I think about finance. We've had some clients who we used to be able to target specific income levels and age demographics for on Meta and other platforms, and it's just becoming more and more broad. So I think
Yeah,
uh, while it feels like super targeted at times, I think from the marketer perspective, it may feel like not as much as we would like to do, which is where the ethical consideration of it
right.
play, right? Um,
And you touch on this, compliance is huge, right? Because a lot of regulated industries have these issues, and the insurance industry has a lot of compliance issues in terms of how far people can go into social, for example. So, if you're a licensed professional of any kind, you're subject to state law.
I want to give everyone a chance. Feel free to, if any questions have arisen while we've been chatting, drop them in the chat. This makes me think, moving down on our questions a little bit. Similar, how should we be navigating misinformation or manipulated metrics? So thinking of bots or fake engagement from your perspective.
It's tough. It's a tough question. Um, I mean, I think if you're not sure about who you're talking to, then you're not sure. And I've had some experiences. I've been doing some things that have led me to be on, call centers in the process of moving. You're connecting something, you're disconnecting a service, that kind of thing. And it's getting harder to tell at what point, the chat bot turns it over to a human. And it's going to get more difficult over the next few years. So you just have to be aware. Now, I mean, some of that is not a bad thing. I remember a couple of years ago, we switched over we got Google Fiber in our neighborhood. And after 30 plus years, we disconnected Cox. And I had to call in, I had to talk to somebody, probably in Atlanta. And it turned out the person that I was talking with had some familiarity with Omaha and started engaging me in a conversation about Omaha. And honestly, at that point, I just wanted to do business. A chat bot, if it had taken care of what I wanted to do, I'd have been very happy. So, obviously humans can be good and not so good at what they do. They can be professional or not so professional at what they do. And so again, it's not one or the other. It's how we use the tools. I do think we're probably going to see, and part of this will be regulatory, and part of it will be people will innovate. To the extent that people want to know this answer, am I talking to a chat bot or a human? Somebody is going to innovate a product that we can buy that will plug in that will tell us, or at least give us a percentage, right? I'm 90% sure this is human, or 90% sure this is a chatbot. It's kind of like what we talk about in sentiment analysis. Like my friend Todd Murphy, who some of you might know at TrueScope, used to be Universal Information Services. They have sentiment analysis with built into TrueScope, but it gives you kind of an estimate of the reliability of whether this is positive, neutral, or negative. And I think the same thing is going to be true. I don't think we're ever going to be maybe necessarily 100% sure of what's going on, because there are always going to be unethical marketing players out there. But if we can minimize the chances that someone in Nigeria wants your bank account information, that kind of thing that we've gone through in the past, that's going to be a good thing, right? And you talk about like banking and finance. I've been really impressed with the 3 banks that we do business with, of how they have navigated this shift from 100% branch banking to a mixture. And I know bankers, and a lot of them are doing as much online as they do face to face. But when people want a face to face experience, they're there for them. When people just need to be convenient and don't need to drive in from a distant location, they can do it that way as well. There are great ways now to authenticate identity, and that's, I think, where the exciting stuff is happening, where maybe at both ends of the communication, there's going to be an authentication badge that says, yeah, this is who you think this person is. And right, because right now, the usual old rule of thumb was somebody sent you an email with a phone number, you better call that number, see who answers, see if it sounds legit to you, see if they can transfer you to that person, see if it aligns with with what is going on before you get on their secure system to do business. So it gets very complicated in that compliance sense, I think, of making it all work, but there are people working the problem. And, I think it's fair to say, just like with Zoom, we were talking about this before the webinar gets started, a lot of this can save a lot of time. It can make our lives better, but we just can't let it take over our lives. So, going back to like social media use, one of the things I always talk about with students is, how much are you using it? When do you put it down? Can you stop for dinner? Can you have a nice conversation over coffee with someone and put that aside and have that human communication? Because one of the biggest challenges, I think, now with the generation raised on iPads and YouTube is going to be, okay, that's great. You know a lot of stuff, but can you make eye contact with me and have a conversation? Can we actually interact and go back and forth and understand each other? Because communication, if I go back to my doctoral dissertation real quickly, is about 3 things. It's about being able to, there's a great model called co-orientation that we used. It's if you're really communicating well, if you and I, Abbie, are having a great conversation and somebody asks you a question, what does Abbie think about such and such? I should be able to accurately predict what you would say. And you should be able to accurately, within reason, predict how I would answer the question after having this conversation for an hour. And to the extent that we're on the same page, and we can predict each other, then that's where you get this thing called agreement or understanding. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're so challenged to do in 2025, is to agree on anything and understand, And so to me, that's where, there were some great quotes back in the day. There's nothing so practical as a great theory. If you can find a great theory, it should hold up in 2025 as good as it did in 1940. And some of them do, because human communication has been fundamental for a long time, since we came out of the caves and all of that. So I do think that we are progressing, that the technology has its advantages, But it comes back to, at the end of the book there, we talk about critical thinking, media literacy. We can't, kind of let our brains go fuzzy because the technology can do all of this for us. We got to stay engaged and alert and aware of what's going on around us. And then I think we'll be okay. I mean, I think the potential is good, but we also have to be open to change. I mean, like our politics right now is so dramatically changing, so probably too quickly. Organizational change, it's a good idea to change fast enough that people don't get frustrated, right? That it's not changing fast enough, but slow enough to bring everybody along. That's usually the comfort space. If you just throw a switch one day, like Elon Musk likes to do, and change everything, that leaves people sort of disoriented and uncomfortable. And so it's going to be interesting to see how we all respond to this change at the social and individual level. And again, anytime you have this kind of change, winners, losers. So you've got to look at your business model and make sure that it is adapting at least to the opportunities and away from the threats. And if you do that kind of, smart goal thinking with SWOT analysis or whatever other tools you're using, then I think you're going to be okay. Because I think if you care as much as everybody, who came today to spend an hour over lunch cares, I do these all the time as an audience member because I care enough that I want to know right answers to questions. And I know, my right answer 5 years ago might be wrong today. So I think that's really the key is to keep learning. We like to talk at universities about being a lifelong learner. That's really important. You can't just because the change is happening whether you like it or not. You can't be a laggard to the extent that you just shut it all off and say, I'm not going there. You have to adapt it to what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you ended on just that ability to adapt is huge for marketers. And I really liked that prediction thing. Next time I have a conversation with someone, I'm going to say, predict what I'm thinking now. You should be able to do that.
I mean, we would hope that, like, let's say you're in a relationship with somebody over a long period of time. We would hope that you've been communicating well enough that you could kind of predict what each other is thinking or saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we're at time, but thank you so much for all of these insights. Really great. I've enjoyed the conversation. And thank you, everyone, for hopping on today. We really appreciate that.
And thank you, Melody, for helping organize this, Abbie.
Of course.
Yes, thanks to our program's chairs and to our sponsors, as Abbie mentioned early on. And our next event is coming up this week as well. On Thursday, we'll have networking and arcade competitions at Arcade 33, and that starts at 6 o'clock. It's online if you'd like to register to attend. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Abbie. Thank you, Jeremy. It was just excellent. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Abbie.
You were
Abbie.
awesome, Jeremy.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well,
You're a
I just
wealth of